In August 1847, a wealthy widow in Natchez, Mississippi made a decision that would horrify even the brutal standards of plantation society. Margaret Thornton, 43 years old, owner of Oakwood Plantation and mother to 5 unmarried daughters ages 16 to 24, summoned her overseer to her study and gave him an order that would eventually lead to one of the most disturbing legal cases in Mississippi history. She wanted him to identify the tallest, strongest enslaved man on the plantation, not for field work, not for sale, but for what she called a bloodline improvement project involving her own daughters. Margaret Thornton had become convinced, through pseudoscientific theories popular among certain plantation owners, that she could breed a new generation of what she termed superior white stock by forcing her daughters to conceive children with a carefully selected enslaved man whose physical traits she admired, then raising those children as white through deliberate erasure of their paternity. This is buried truths, and I'm about to tell you one of the most psychologically twisted stories we've ever documented. Before we begin, understand this. We are now on our weekly series uncovering suppressed slavery history from primary sources. If you're new here, we've documented over 47 cases of hidden resistance, moral complexity, and systemic horror that textbooks won't teach. Subscribe right now, hit that red button below this video, because the story you're about to hear is so disturbing, so morally complex, and so thoroughly documented that you'll need to follow us weekly to process what history actually looked like. Turn on the notification bell so YouTube shows you when we post next Saturday. Now let's dive into Margaret Thornton's breeding plan and the 5 daughters who had to survive it. Margaret Thornton was born Margaret Whitfield in 1804 to a moderately wealthy South Carolina family. She married Richard Thornton in 1822, a Mississippi planter 20 years her senior who owned Oakwood Plantation, approximately 600 acres of cotton land worked by 45 enslaved people. Between 1823 and 1831, Margaret gave birth to 5 daughters: Sarah, Mary Elizabeth, Catherine, and Anne. No sons survived infancy, a source of what family letters describe as Richard's deep disappointment. Richard Thornton died in 1845 of yellow fever, leaving the plantation entirely to Margaret with the expectation, stated explicitly in his will, that she would manage it until the daughters married suitable men who could assume control. But Margaret had different ideas. According to letters discovered in 1972 in a Charleston archive, Margaret had become fascinated by theories of selective breeding that some plantation owners applied to enslaved populations. She'd read agricultural journals that discussed breeding enslaved people for specific physical traits: height, strength, even temperament, the way one might breed horses or cattle. But Margaret took this disturbing logic in an unprecedented direction. In letters to her sister in Charleston dated early 1847, Margaret expressed her belief that the Thornton family line was becoming weakened by generations of cousin marriages and delicate constitutions. She wrote, "I have observed that the Negro slaves, particularly those of prime physical specimen, possess a vitality and strength that our own class has bred out through excessive refinement. What if this vigor could be introduced into white bloodlines while maintaining social position through careful management of paternity acknowledgement?" This wasn't scientific thinking. It was eugenic delusion mixed with the absolute power slavery gave her over human beings she viewed as breeding stock. Margaret had convinced herself she could use an enslaved man as what she termed a vigor donor to her daughters, then raise the resulting mixed race children as white by simply declaring them so and controlling the narrative about their conception. I need to pause here because what comes next gets significantly worse. If you're already feeling disturbed by where this is heading, that's appropriate. But I need you to subscribe to Buried Truths right now. Here's why we document stories like this every single week from court records, plantation journals, and archive testimonies that historians buried because they're too complex, too disturbing, or too challenging to simple historical narratives. This is episode 88. We post every Saturday at 8. Hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss next week's episode about the enslaved woman who testified in court 14 times trying to prove her freedom, and how the legal system crushed her every single time. Turn on notifications, that bell icon next to subscribe, because YouTube's algorithm won't show you our videos unless you tell it to. Now back to Margaret Thornton and what she did to her own daughters. In July 1847, Margaret ordered her overseer, a man named William Clark whose journals survived in the Mississippi Department of Archives, to measure every adult enslaved man on Oakwood Plantation. Height, build, physical condition, temperament. Clark's journal from July 18, 1847 records his confusion. Mistress Thornton has instructed me to compile measurements and observations of the male slaves for purposes she describes as bloodline planning. I confess I do not understand her meaning, though I have done as ordered. The man who met Margaret's criteria was named Marcus. Plantation records describe him as approximately 6 feet 3 inches tall, exceptionally tall for the 1840s, about 28 years old, born on the plantation, described in ledgers as strong constitution. Even temperament, no history of rebellion or resistance. Marcus worked primarily in the plantation's blacksmith shop, a skilled position that gave him slightly more autonomy than field workers. What Margaret did next is documented in multiple sources that converged during historical research in the 1970s and 80s: her own letters, Clark's journals, and most significantly, testimony given decades later by 2 of the daughters and by Marcus's descendants who preserved oral history about what they called the Thornton arrangement. In August 1847, Margaret called her 5 daughters together, 24th Mary, 22 Elizabeth's at 20, Catherine's 18 and Anna's 16, and explained her plan. According to testimony given by Anne in 1889 to a northern journalist, Margaret framed it as family duty and scientific necessity. She told them that the Thornton line needed strengthening, and that she had identified a way to accomplish this while maintaining their social position. Each daughter would, in turn, conceive a child with Marcus. The children would be raised as white, as legitimate Thorntons, with no acknowledgement of their actual paternity. Margaret would claim they were the results of brief, secret marriages to men who had died, a plausible lie given the frequency of early death in this era. Anne's testimony, preserved in an 1889 newspaper article from a Philadelphia abolitionist paper, describes the scene. Mother presented this as if it were a scientific agricultural decision, no different from selecting breeding stock for the stables. She explained that we would not be sullied because this was for family improvement, not base pleasure. She expected our compliance as she expected compliance in all household decisions. We were to think of Marcus not as a man, but as an instrument of family preservation. The sisters' reactions, based on fragmentary evidence, varied. Sarah, the eldest, apparently objected initially, but was worn down by Margaret's insistence and threats about inheritance. Mary seems to have accepted out of defeated resignation. Elizabeth's response is unrecorded. Catherine was described in family letters as having fallen into melancholy from which she never fully recovered. Anne, the youngest at 16, later testified that she felt she had no choice. Refusal meant being cut off from family, inheritance, and any possibility of future marriage to a suitable man, as Margaret threatened to destroy the reputation of any daughter who refused. Stop and think about what you're hearing. A mother forcing her own daughters into a breeding arrangement with an enslaved man, not for his benefit, not even acknowledging his humanity, but treating him as genetic material to be used. And we haven't even discussed what this meant for Marcus, who had no ability to refuse, whose consent was impossible in a system where enslaved people were property. This is exactly why Buried Truths exists, to document the full spectrum of horror that slavery created, not just physical brutality, but psychological torture, sexual coercion disguised as science, and the ways power corrupted every human relationship it touched. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We document stories like this every week from primary sources. Next week, the woman who fought the legal system 14 times for her freedom. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're here for it. Now let's talk about what happened to Marcus and these 5 sisters. Marcus's perspective on the Thornton arrangement comes to us through oral history preserved by his descendants and through fragments of testimony he gave much later. What's clear is that he understood immediately what was being demanded, and that refusal would mean severe punishment, sail away from family members also enslaved at Oakwood, or death. The power dynamic made consent impossible. This was rape by coercion, even if no physical violence was used in the moment, because the entire structure of slavery was violence. According to family oral history recorded in a 1930s WPA Slave Narrative Project interview with Marcus's great-grandson, Marcus tried to resist by requesting that he be sold to another plantation. Margaret refused. He then attempted to run away in September 1847 but was captured within 2 days and brought back. Clark's journal from September 15, 1847 records returned runaway Marcus to Mistress Thornton. She ordered no whipping, which surprised me, but instead instructed that he be held in the quarters under guard until further notice. Margaret's Bloodline project began in earnest in October 1847, Over the next 5 years, according to plantation birth records and census data, 5 children were born to the Thornton daughters. Sarah gave birth to a son in 1848, Mary to a daughter in 1849, Elizabeth to a son in 1850, Catherine to a daughter in 1851, and Anne to a son in 1852. All 5 children were recorded in family documents as Thornton, with no father listed, all described as white in official records, despite what medical examination would have revealed about their parentage. Margaret controlled every aspect of the arrangement and its aftermath. The children were raised in the main house as white Thorntons. Marcus remained enslaved, working in the blacksmith shop, forbidden from acknowledging his children or having any paternal relationship with them. The daughters were kept socially isolated during their pregnancies, with Margaret telling neighbors and extended family that each was recovering from illness or visiting relatives. After giving birth, the daughters were gradually reintroduced to society with their deceased husband's children. The psychological damage this arrangement inflicted on everyone involved is evident in fragmentary records. Anne's later testimony describes living in a state of constant dissociation, treating the arrangement as something happening to someone else. Catherine's melancholy deepened into what letters describe as periods of complete withdrawal from reality. Sarah developed what family letters called nervous complaints that persisted throughout her life. Marcus, according to his descendants, became emotionally numb, describing himself as a ghost walking through my own life. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Margaret's plan required more than just controlling the present. It required controlling the future narrative. As the children grew, they would eventually ask questions about their fathers. Margaret prepared for this by creating elaborate false histories for each deceased husband, complete with forged letters and manufactured family connections. She coached her daughters on the stories they were to tell. She warned them that any deviation from the official narrative would result in social destruction for them and their children. Before I tell you how this story eventually unraveled, because it did dramatically in 1865, I need you to understand something. We only know this story because multiple independent sources of evidence survived and were discovered across decades of archival research. Margaret Thornton's letters weren't found until 1972. Marcus's descendants weren't interviewed until the 1930s. Anne's testimony wasn't rediscovered until the 1980s. This is how buried truths work, fragments scattered across time that researchers have to piece together. And if stories this documented, this recent, this well preserved can still be buried for over a century, how many others are lost completely? That's why you need to subscribe to Buried Truths. We're building the largest archive of suppressed slavery history on YouTube, and every subscriber helps us reach more people with these stories. Hit subscribe right now. Turn on notifications. Next week, Maria's 14 freedom purchases and 14 re-enslavements. Now let's talk about what happened when the Civil War ended and truth became harder to control. For nearly 2 decades, Margaret Thornton maintained control of the narrative. The 5 children grew up believing they were white Thorntons with deceased fathers who had been merchants or professionals from distant cities. Marcus remained enslaved at Oakwood, working the blacksmith shop, living with the knowledge that he had 5 children he couldn't acknowledge, couldn't parent, couldn't protect from the poisonous lie they were being raised in. Then came 1865. The Civil War ended, slavery was abolished. The power structure that had enabled Margaret's entire scheme collapsed, and Marcus, now approximately 46 years old, made a decision that would expose everything. According to testimony preserved in Freedmen's Bureau records from Natchez, Marcus approached Union soldiers in June 1865 and told them he had 5 children being raised as white in the Thornton household, that he was their father, and that the arrangement had been forced by Margaret Thornton. The soldiers initially didn't believe him. The claim seemed too bizarre, too twisted even for slavery's documented horrors. But Marcus was persistent. He named the children, described their births, recounted details about the arrangement that could only be known by someone intimately involved. The Freedmen's Bureau launched an investigation. They interviewed the Thornton daughters, now ranging in age from 33 to 41. They interviewed Marcus extensively. They examined plantation records, birth records and correspondence, and slowly, horribly, the truth emerged. Sarah, Mary, and Elizabeth refused to testify against their mother, maintaining the fiction of deceased husbands. But Catherine and Anne, the 2 youngest, broke. Catherine's testimony to the Freedmen's Bureau in July 1865 is preserved in the National Archives. I have lived in hell for 18 years. Mother forced this arrangement on us when we were too young to resist, too dependent to refuse. She treated us like breeding stock. She treated Marcus like an animal to be used. And she forced us to pretend our children were white, to raise them in a lie, to never acknowledge the man who is their father. I cannot live with this anymore. I will speak the truth even if it destroys me. Anne's testimony was even more detailed, confirming Marcus's account and adding psychological insight into Margaret's motivations and methods. The testimonies created a scandal that ripped through Natchez society. The Thornton daughters were socially destroyed. The very outcome Margaret had threatened to prevent their resistance. The 5 children, now ranging in age from 13 to 17, learned the truth about their parentage in the most traumatic way possible. But here's what's most revealing about how power works. Margaret Thornton faced no legal consequences, no prosecution, no charges. The Freedmen's Bureau investigation documented what had happened, but had no framework for prosecuting a white woman for coercing her own daughters into sexual arrangements with an enslaved man she owned. The sexual violence against Marcus wasn't recognized as rape because the legal system still struggled to acknowledge enslaved men as victims of sexual coercion by white women. The psychological abuse of the daughters was dismissed as family matters. The deception practiced on the children was considered regrettable but not criminal. Margaret Thornton died in 1868 at age 64, having never publicly acknowledged wrongdoing. Her will attempted to distribute the plantation among her daughters and their children, still referring to them as legitimate Thorntons with no mention of their actual parentage. What happened to the people whose lives Margaret destroyed? Marcus took the surname Freeman after emancipation. Marcus Freeman. He attempted to build relationships with his 5 children, now young teenagers, who had just learned he was their father. According to family oral history, this was extraordinarily difficult. The children had been raised to see themselves as white and to view enslaved people as fundamentally different from themselves. Learning that their father was the man they'd seen working in the blacksmith shop, that their entire identity was built on a lie, created psychological trauma that some never recovered from. Of the 5 children, only 2 eventually accepted Marcus as their father. The eldest son, born to Sarah, chose to maintain his identity as white and refused all contact with Marcus. The daughter born to Mary moved to another state and changed her name. But the son born to Elizabeth and the daughter born to Catherine did eventually form relationships with Marcus, though these were complicated by years of psychological damage and racial identity confusion. Anne Thornton, the youngest daughter who had been 16 when the arrangement began, never married and never recovered from what she called the years of horror. She lived in increasingly poor circumstances, estranged from most of her family, and died in 1893. Her testimony from 1889 to the Philadelphia Journalist represents her attempt to ensure the truth was recorded. I want the world to know what slavery made possible. Not just the enslavement of Marcus, but the enslavement of my sisters and myself to our mother's twisted plan. We were all property in her eyes. Marcus by law, us by social custom that gave fathers and mothers absolute power over daughters. Catherine Thornton, whose early melancholy deepened over the years, spent her final decades living with her daughter, Marcus's daughter, in what family letters describe as periods of lucidity interrupted by complete withdrawal. She died in 1901, having never fully escaped the psychological prison her mother created. Sarah and Mary, the 2 eldest who refused to testify against Margaret, maintained the fiction of their deceased husbands until their deaths in the 1880s. They raised their children as white, insisted on the false narrative, and severed ties with Catherine and Anne for betraying the family. Elizabeth, the middle daughter whose thoughts are least documented, lived quietly on what remained of the divided plantation property until her death in 1895. Her son, Marcus's son, inherited the land and lived as a man of mixed race in the Reconstruction South, facing discrimination from both white and black communities. Marcus Freeman himself lived until 1890, dying at approximately 71 years old. Interviews conducted with him in the 1880s by Freedmen's Bureau workers show a man still processing the psychological damage of the Thornton arrangement. He described himself as having been used like a tool, not seen as a man, forced into acts I could not refuse. He expressed grief over the fractured relationships with most of his children and anger that Margaret faced no consequences for what she'd done. So how do we understand a story like this? Margaret Thornton victimized her own daughters, forcing them into sexual arrangements they couldn't refuse without destroying their futures. But those daughters also perpetuated the system by raising mixed-race children as white, by denying Marcus his paternity, by maintaining the lie. Marcus was absolutely a victim of sexual coercion and decades of psychological torture. But the children born from this arrangement were also victims, raised in a lie, denied their father, given false identities that unraveled traumatically. Margaret Thornton's Bloodline Improvement Project reveals how slavery corrupted every human relationship it touched. She could treat her own daughters as breeding stock because plantation society already treated enslaved women that way. She just applied that logic to her own family. She could coerce Marcus because slavery made black men's bodies property to be used however white owners decided. She could falsify her grandchildren's identities because racial categories were always constructed lies maintained through power, not truth. The system created Margaret Thornton. It gave her the power, the pseudoscientific justification, and the absolute legal control over other human beings that made her twisted plan possible. And when that system collapsed in 1865, she faced no consequences because the legal system didn't know how to recognize this particular horror. Sexual coercion of daughters combined with sexual violence against enslaved men, combined with racial identity fraud on children. The story stayed buried for over a century because it was too complex, too disturbing, too challenging to simple narratives about slavery. It involved a white woman as perpetrator, white daughters as victims who were also complicit, an enslaved man as victim of sexual violence. Categories that made historians uncomfortable. So the fragments stayed scattered in archives until researchers in the 1970s and 80s started finding them and piecing the horror together. That's the truth they tried to bury. Margaret Thornton, 1847-1865, documented in letters discovered in 1972, in overseer journals archived in Mississippi, in Freedmen's Bureau testimony from 1865, in Ann's 1889 testimony, in Marcus's 1880s interviews, and family oral histories preserved through the 1930s WPA project. Multiple independent sources converging to prove this nightmare actually happened. This is buried truths. These are the stories they tried to erase. We're making sure they never disappear again. Subscribe now. Turn on notifications. I'll see you next Saturday with Maria's 14 impossible purchases of her stolen freedom. Don't let these stories stay buried. Subscribe to Buried Truths. See you next week.